Welcome. If you enjoy these stories, please like, share and subscribe. For a bit of fun, comment where you're from and what time you're watching this video. Now lie back, relax and let sleep consume you. The dust swirled around our ankles as we walked, our stomachs aching with a gnawing emptiness that had become our constant companion. The crops had failed. The animals had perished. The once vibrant village was now a husk, its inhabitants gaunt and hollow-eyed. Hope had become a forgotten luxury. Then the whispers began. An old woman, living deep within the shadowed woods, offered sustenance. Some scoffed, muttering about folklore and dangers lurking in the ancient trees. But the hunger was a powerful persuader, a relentless gnawing that eroded caution. A small group of us, driven by desperation, ventured into the forest. The trees grew tall and dense, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers blocking out the weak sunlight. The path, barely discernible, wound deeper and deeper, leading us into a world that felt ancient and removed from our suffering. Finally we reached a clearing. A small cottage stood nestled amongst the trees, smoke curling invitingly from its chimney. An old woman stood in the doorway, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes surprisingly bright. She smiled, a welcoming gesture that eased some of the tension in our shoulders. She ushered us inside. The interior of the cottage was surprisingly warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the bleakness we had left behind. A large table was laden with food. There was a stew, rich and fragrant, and bread still warm from the oven. Our mouths watered at the sight. Without a word, we fell upon the feast. The stew was unlike anything we had ever tasted, savory and subtly sweet. The bread was coarse but satisfying. We ate our fill, the first truly satisfying meal in what felt like an eternity. A wave of exhaustion washed over us as our bodies finally relaxed, no longer consumed by the relentless ache of hunger. As the days passed, we remained in the cottage. The old woman was a gracious host, providing us with food and shelter. We helped her with chores, a small repayment for her kindness. But slowly, subtly, things began to feel different. My skin felt taut, stretched somehow. When I looked at my hands, they seemed longer, the fingers more slender. Others in the group began to exhibit similar changes. Their eyes appeared darker, almost black, reflecting the dim light of the cottage with an unsettling intensity. We looked at each other, a silent question passing between us. A prickle of unease ran down my spine, a feeling I couldn't quite place. The food still tasted delicious, but now a faint metallic aftertaste lingered. One evening, as the old woman prepared the stew, I glanced into the pot. Amongst the chunks of vegetables and meat, I saw something that made my stomach churn, something pale and elongated, with what looked like fingers. A wave of nausea washed over me. I backed away from the pot, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at the others. Their eyes, now completely black, stared back at me with an unnerving blankness. Their skin was stretched so thin it seemed translucent. The old woman turned, a smile still on her face, but her eyes, they held a knowing glint, a triumphant gleam that sent a shiver of terror down my spine. I understood then the hospitality, the kindness. It was all a facade. We were trapped. The food, the changes. We were becoming something else, something that belonged to her. I tried to speak, to warn the others, but no sound came out. My throat felt constricted, my vocal cords unresponsive. The transformation continued. My bones felt like they were shifting, elongating. My senses sharpened, but in a way that felt alien, detached. I could see in the dim light with startling clarity, hear the faintest rustle outside the cottage walls. One by one we succumbed. Our former selves faded, replaced by something else. We moved with a strange, jerky gait, our bodies no longer our own. Our purpose became clear, etched into our very being. We were her servants, bound to her will forever. The cottage became our prison, the forest our domain. We moved through the trees, silent and watchful, our dark eyes scanning the surroundings. The hunger was gone, replaced by a different kind of craving, a need to serve, to obey. One day another group of weary travelers stumbled upon the clearing, their faces etched with the same desperation we had once known. The old woman stood in the doorway, her welcoming smile as convincing as ever. We watched from the shadows of the trees as they entered the cottage, their eyes wide with relief at the sight of the food. The smell of the stew wafted through the air, the same savory aroma that had once lured us in. A chilling stillness settled over the clearing. The sounds of feasting drifted from the cottage. Then silence. We waited, our dark eyes fixed on the doorway. One by one they emerged, their movements stiff and unnatural. Their skins seemed taut, their eyes dark. They joined us in the shadows, their faces blank, their transformation complete. The old woman stood in the doorway, watching us, a faint smile playing on her lips. Her collection had grown, and the forest remained silent, concealing its dark secret, waiting for the next wave of desperate souls. The package arrived unexpectedly, a plain brown box with my name scrawled across it in an unfamiliar hand. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a lantern. It was old, crafted from a dark, tarnished metal, its glass panels etched with intricate, unsettling designs. A note accompanied it, written in a shaky script. "Never light this lantern. It belonged to her. Please, for your own sake, leave it untouched." The note was signed by a distant relative I barely remembered. Curiosity, that relentless human flaw, gnawed at me. The lantern possessed a strange allure, a silent promise of secrets held within its aged frame. Despite the stark warning, I found myself drawn to it, my fingers tracing the cold metal, my gaze lost in the cryptic etchings on the glass. That evening, as dusk crept into my home, I found myself holding a match. The warning echoed in my mind, a faint whisper of caution against the rising tide of my fascination. With a hesitant strike, I ignited the wick. A soft glow filled the room, emanating from within the lantern. The light danced and flickered, and as it did, I noticed something peculiar. The lantern cast projections onto the walls, the familiar shapes of its frame and handle outlined in the dim illumination. But alongside these ordinary projections were others, shapes that seemed to writhe and twist independently. They were like figures, elongated and distorted, their edges blurring into the surrounding darkness. They moved with a fluidity that seemed impossible, stretching and contracting, their forms shifting and reforming without any apparent connection to the lantern itself. Then I perceived something else, a faint susurrus, a whisper carried on the edges of the light. It was soft, barely audible, but it was there. As I focused my attention, the whispers grew slightly stronger, coalescing into discernible sounds. They were voices, many voices, speaking in hushed tones. The voices recounted terrible stories, tales of suffering, of pain, of lives twisted and broken. They spoke of a woman, a powerful, malevolent entity who had forged the lantern, using it to ensnare and torment her victims. The whispers described fates worse than death, eternal servitude, and unimaginable transformations. Each night as I lit the lantern, the projections grew more distinct, the whispers more insistent. The figures on the wall seemed to gain substance, their forms becoming clearer, their movements more purposeful. They would point, their elongated fingers directed towards me, as the voices recounted the specific torments of those who had fallen prey to the lantern's creator. Sleep became a distant memory. I spent my nights transfixed by the display on the walls, listening to the endless stream of horrifying narratives. The figures seemed to watch me, their dark, empty spaces where eyes should have been fixed intently on my every move. My reflection in the mirror began to change. It was subtle at first, a slight blurring around the edges, a lack of definition, but as the nights passed, the change became more pronounced. My image seemed to fade, as if the light behind it was dimming. I felt a strange lethargy creeping into my bones, a constant weariness that no amount of rest could alleviate. My energy seemed to drain away, leaving me feeling hollow and weak. The lantern, on the other hand, seemed to grow brighter, its glow intensifying with each passing night. The whispers spoke of a price, a toll that had to be paid. They spoke of souls being drawn into the lantern, becoming fuel for its sinister light, forever bound to its malevolent purpose. One evening, as I stood before the mirror, I barely recognized the gaunt figure staring back at me. My features were indistinct, my eyes sunken and dark. It was as if my very essence was being leached away. The projections on the wall were now almost three-dimensional, the figures writhing and reaching, their whispers a constant chorus of despair. They seemed to beckon me, to invite me to join their ranks. I looked at the lantern, its glow pulsating with an unnatural intensity. The etched designs on its glass seemed to shift and swirl, forming grotesque faces that stared back at me with malevolent glee. My reflection continued to fade, becoming translucent, then barely visible. The last vestiges of my image flickered and vanished, leaving only the empty space where I once stood. The lantern burned brighter than ever, its light casting vivid, animated projections onto the walls. The figures danced and celebrated, their whispers now filled with a triumphant glee. The lantern sat on the table, its sinister glow illuminating the room, its glass panels reflecting the writhing forms within. The light pulsed, and within its depths, a new, indistinct figure began to take shape. The village huddled along the coastline, its existence intertwined with the rhythm of the sea. Generations had cast their nets into the churning waters, their lives dictated by the tides and the bounty they yielded. But a new presence had begun to encroach upon their lives, a silent, suffocating entity that arrived with the setting sun. Each night, as darkness descended, a dense white fog rolled in from the ocean. It was unlike any fog they had ever known, thicker and more opaque, swallowing the familiar landmarks of the village. A chilling stillness accompanied its arrival, muffling the sounds of the waves and the cries of the gulls. Those who strayed into the mist never returned. Husbands, fathers, sons, they vanished without a trace, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a growing despair. The villagers learned to bar their doors and shutter their windows as soon as the first tendrils of fog crept through the narrow streets. Fear became a constant companion, a silent dread that hung in the air even during the daylight hours. I had seen my own brother walk into the fog one night, searching for a lost fishing net. He had called out my name, his voice fading into the swirling whiteness, and then silence. The memory haunted my waking hours, fueling a desperate need to understand, to uncover the truth behind the encroaching mist. One evening, as the familiar white blanket began to envelop the village, I made my decision. Ignoring the pleas of my neighbors, I walked towards the edge of the fog. A cold dread gripped me, but the yearning for answers was stronger than my fear. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the swirling vapor. The world around me dissolved into a featureless white void. Visibility was near zero. I could feel the dampness clinging to my skin, the air heavy and still. Disorientation set in almost immediately. I tried to keep my bearings, to maintain a sense of direction, but the fog seemed to twist and distort my perceptions. There were no sounds, only a profound, unsettling silence. It was as if I had stepped into a world devoid of life, a blank canvas where nothing existed. I walked on, driven by a desperate hope of finding something, anything that could explain the disappearances. After what felt like an eternity, the fog began to thin slightly. Shapes started to emerge from the whiteness, indistinct at first, then gradually becoming clearer. I found myself in a place that was both familiar and utterly alien. It resembled the village, yet it was different. The buildings were the same, but they appeared older, more dilapidated. The fishing boats on the shore were rotted and broken. A sense of profound decay permeated everything, and then I saw them. Figures moving slowly through the fog, their forms indistinct and ethereal. They seemed lost, their movements aimless, their faces etched with a deep sorrow. They were the missing villagers, I realized with a jolt of horror, but they were no longer as they had been. As I watched them, a figure emerged from the swirling mist. Tall and gaunt, cloaked in shadows, she possessed an aura of ancient power. Her eyes, though I could not see them clearly, seemed to pierce through the fog, fixing on me with an unnerving intensity. An understanding washed over me, cold and absolute. This was the witch. She controlled the fog, and these were the souls she had claimed. Panic surged through me. I turned to flee, to escape this timeless, desolate place. But as I ran, the landscape shifted around me. The dilapidated buildings gave way to the familiar streets of my village, the fog swirling and receding, only to return again the same way it always did. I stumbled, my breath catching in my throat. A sense of déjà vu washed over me, a chilling familiarity with the sequence of events. The fog rolling in, the disappearances, my venture into the mist. It had all happened before. A horrifying realization dawned. I had not just stepped into a place outside of time, I was trapped within it. The witch's curse was not just for the others, it was for me too. I had been here before, countless times, reliving the same futile attempt to escape. The fog swirled around me, the ethereal figures of the lost villagers, moving through it like ghosts. In the distance I could see the familiar outline of my own home, the lights flickering in the windows. A profound despair settled over me. There was no escape. The nightmare would continue, the fog would return each night, and I would be there, lost in its timeless embrace, forever part of the witch's collection. The cycle would repeat endlessly. The field lay just beyond the edge of town, a silent congregation of scarecrows standing sentinel against the horizon. They had been there for as long as anyone could remember, their forms tattered and weathered, yet never truly decaying. Year after year they remained, their vacant eyes staring out across the empty fields. Autumn always brought a sense of unease to the town. As the leaves turned and the days grew shorter, a few townsfolk would invariably vanish. No witnesses, no explanations, just an empty space where someone once was. And then, as if in grim recompense, new scarecrows would appear in the field, their straw-stuffed bodies joining the silent ranks. My wife Martha loved autumn. She found beauty in the changing colours, in the crispness of the air. This year, however, autumn had brought only a hollow ache. One morning she was simply gone. Her side of the bed was cold, her coffee untouched on the table. The door was locked from the inside. There was no sign of struggle, no note, nothing. The sheriff offered platitudes, spoke of runaways and wanderers. But I knew Martha. She wouldn't have left without a word. A cold dread settled in my stomach, a certainty that something terrible had happened. Driven by a grief that clawed at my insides, I found myself drawn to the field. The scarecrows stood in their usual places, their ragged clothes flapping gently in the breeze. They seemed more numerous this year, their silent ranks stretching further across the barren land. I walked among them, my boots crunching on the dry earth. Their stitched smiles seemed mocking, their button eyes cold and lifeless. I searched for any sign, any clue that might explain Martha's disappearance. One scarecrow stood slightly apart from the others, closer to the edge of the woods. Its form was different somehow. It wasn't as loosely stuffed as the others. Its limbs had a certain definition. As I drew nearer, a sickening realization began to dawn. The material wasn't straw. It had a texture, a pallor that was disturbingly familiar. With trembling hands, I reached out and touched one of its arms. It was cold, stiff, and undeniably bone. My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled back, my mind reeling in horror. These weren't scarecrows in the traditional sense. They were something else, something unspeakable. I moved closer again, forcing myself to examine them. Beneath the tattered clothing, I could see the contours of human forms. The faces, crudely stitched and covered with burlap, couldn't completely conceal the underlying structure of skulls. A wave of nausea washed over me. I recognized a belt buckle on one figure, the faded fabric of a shirt on another. They were the missing townsfolk. They had become part of the field. A chilling gust of wind swept through the field, causing the scarecrows to sway in unison. From the depths of the nearby woods, I sensed a presence, an ancient, malevolent force that permeated the very air. The witch. The stories, the whispers passed down through generations, they were true. She haunted this land, and the scarecrow field was her grim harvest. She ensured that the town was never without its silent sentinels, her power sustained by the lives she claimed each autumn. My gaze fell upon a scarecrow standing near the center of the field. Its frame was slightly smaller than the others, its clothes familiar. A piece of blue fabric, the color of Martha's favorite dress, fluttered from its sleeve. A silent scream built within me, a soundless agony that echoed the vacant stares of the figures surrounding me. I stood there amidst the field of flesh and bone, the horrifying truth laid bare. The wind whispered through the tattered clothes of the scarecrows, a mournful sigh that carried the weight of their stolen lives. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red, casting long, grotesque shapes across the field. The witch's harvest was complete for another year. My child lay still, a fragile form barely breathing against the worn pillows. The fever had raged for days, stealing the light from their eyes and the strength from their small limbs. The village healer had offered herbs and poultices, but nothing had worked. Desperation clawed at me, a raw, visceral need to save my child. Whispers circulated in the village, hushed tales of an old woman who lived high in the jagged peaks, a recluse said to possess strange powers. Some called her a healer, others spoke of darker arts. Driven by a sliver of hope, I decided to seek her out. The journey was arduous. The mountain path was steep and treacherous, winding through dense forests and across rocky slopes. Days blurred into a tiring sequence of climbing and stumbling, my determination fueled by the image of my child's pale face. Finally, I reached a small, isolated hut nestled amongst the crags. Smoke curled from its chimney, a sign of life in this desolate place. I approached hesitantly and knocked on the weathered wooden door. It creaked open, revealing an old woman with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. Her face was a network of wrinkles, her hands gnarled and thin. She looked at me, her gaze piercing, as if she could see the desperation in my soul. Without speaking, I conveyed my plight, the silent plea of a mother for her child. The old woman listened, her expression unchanging. After a long moment she nodded. She would help, she indicated, but in return I must agree to a small favour. I readily agreed, my relief overwhelming my apprehension. The favour seemed insignificant at the time, a vague request that I would fulfil once my child was well. Returning home, I administered the potion the old woman had given me. It was bitter and dark, but within hours a change came over my child. The fever broke, their breathing became easier, and a faint colour returned to their cheeks. Gratitude washed over me, so profound it brought tears to my eyes. My child slowly regained their health, their laughter once again filling our small cottage. But as the days turned into weeks, strange occurrences began. Objects would shift inexplicably. Food that was fresh one moment would be inexplicably spoiled the next, covered in mould or attracting swarms of flies. The projections the lamp cast against the walls seemed to writhe and distort in ways that defied logic. They would stretch and elongate, their forms taking on unsettling shapes that had no connection to the lamp itself. More disturbingly, I began to feel a persistent fatigue, a draining of my vitality that left me feeling weak and listless. My hair seemed to lose its luster, my skin becoming pale and thin. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back, someone older, more worn than I remembered. The old woman's words about a favour echoed in my mind, a seed of dread beginning to sprout. I tried to recall the specifics of her request, but it remained vague, a fleeting impression of something inconsequential. As my strength waned, my child thrived, their energy boundless, their laughter bright. It was as if the vitality that was draining from me was somehow flowing into them. One evening I saw my reflection flicker in the window pane. It was ephemeral, almost transparent, as if the light behind it was fading. A cold understanding settled upon me. The favour the witch had asked for was not a simple task. She had taken something far more precious, my years, my life force. The energy that sustained me was being transferred, slowly but surely, to the old woman in the mountains. I was becoming an empty vessel, a husk, while she in turn grew younger, stronger, fueled by my fading vitality. I looked at my child, healthy and happy, playing innocently in the fading light. A bittersweet ache filled my chest. I had saved them, but at what cost? My movements became laboured, each breath a conscious effort. The world around me seemed to grow dim, my senses fading. I could still see my child, their bright eyes full of life, but my vision was becoming blurred. The projections from the lamp danced on the walls, grotesque and elongated. The air in the cottage felt cold, devoid of warmth. My limbs felt like lead, my body heavy and unresponsive. My child came to my side, their small hand reaching for mine. Their touch was warm, full of life. I tried to smile, but my lips felt stiff and unresponsive. My gaze drifted towards the window, towards the distant peaks where the old woman resided. A chilling stillness settled over me, a finality that offered no comfort. My vision narrowed, the light fading to a pinprick. My passion lay in the acquisition of unique artifacts, relics with a history, preferably one tinged with the unusual. When I learned of the auction at the Blackwood estate, a property notorious for its former occupant, a woman whispered to have dabbled in dark practices, I knew I had to attend. The estate was in ruins, the house a skeletal frame against the stormy sky. Inside, amidst the decay and debris, were remnants of a life steeped in the arcane. It was there, in a dusty cobweb-draped corner, that I found it. An antique doll. It sat upright in a broken rocking chair, its porcelain face cracked in places, its painted eyes staring with an unsettling intensity. Its clothes were faded and torn, but there was an undeniable aura about it, a sense of age and something else, of something akin to a dormant energy. I purchased it immediately, captivated by its eerie charm. Back in my study, under the soft glow of lamplight, I examined it more closely. Its features were delicate yet severe, its expression fixed in a perpetual, unsettling gaze. Its limbs were jointed, allowing for a limited range of. The first night, I placed the doll carefully on a shelf facing my bed. When I awoke the following morning, its position had changed. It now sat facing the wall. I initially dismissed it as a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination, but it happened again the next night and the night after that. Each morning I would find the doll in a different pose, sometimes subtly altered, other times dramatically so. It was as if it moved while I slept. I tried setting up a camera, hoping to capture the phenomenon. But the footage revealed nothing, only the still form of the doll throughout the night. Yet, the next morning, its position would invariably be different. A strange sensation began to accompany these nightly occurrences. I would sometimes wake in the middle of the night with a stiff neck or an aching back, feeling as though I had been engaged in some physical activity while asleep. I couldn't recall any dreams, only a vague sense of restlessness. Then I noticed my hands. They felt different, stiffer than usual, the skin feeling taut and strangely smooth. I examined them closely. The texture seemed almost porcelain-like, the fine lines and wrinkles subtly fading. The changes progressed. My joints became increasingly rigid, my movements less fluid. My skin grew paler, developing a faint, almost imperceptible network of fine cracks, like hairline fractures on old china. My reflection in the mirror became a source of growing alarm. My eyes, once a warm brown, were darkening, the pupils expanding until they seemed to consume the irises entirely. They appeared glassy, devoid of the usual warmth and life. The compulsion intensified. Each night I would awaken with an overwhelming urge to adjust the doll. I would find myself standing before it, my stiff fingers moving almost against my will, repositioning its limbs, tilting its head, ensuring its posture was just so. I had no conscious recollection of these actions, only the lingering stiffness in my body the next morning. The cracks in my skin became more pronounced, spreading across my hands, my arms, my face. They were fine at first, but they deepened with each passing night, resembling the crazing on antique porcelain. My vision began to blur, my perception of the world becoming increasingly two-dimensional, as if I were viewing it through painted eyes. My sense of touch diminished, my skin feeling numb and unresponsive. The doll remained on the shelf, its painted gaze fixed, its porcelain face impassive, yet I felt an undeniable connection to it, a silent understanding that transcended the boundaries of the inanimate and the living. One morning, I awoke to find myself completely immobile. My limbs were stiff, locked in place. My skin felt cold and hard, the network of cracks now prominent across my entire body. My eyes, completely black and glassy, stared straight ahead, seeing nothing. I could perceive the world around me, the faint sounds of the city filtering through the window, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. But I could not move, could not speak, could not even blink. I was on display, an object amongst objects in my own study. The antique doll sat on the shelf, its position unchanged from the night before. Its painted eyes seemed to meet mine, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. The collector had become the collected. The Witch's Hollow collection had gained another edition, forever trapped in a lifeless, staring form, a silent testament to the dark allure of the past. The path had been overgrown for years, barely a suggestion of a trail leading deeper into the woods. We'd been hiking for days, seeking a remote spot far from any sign of civilization. The map, tattered and faded, indicated an old logging town that had been abandoned decades ago. Curiosity, a foolish companion in such endeavors, had driven us onward. Finally, through a tangle of branches and undergrowth, we saw it. Buildings, weathered and worn, stood in a silent clearing. The town was smaller than anticipated, a cluster of perhaps a dozen structures huddled together as if for warmth against the encroaching forest. A stillness hung in the air, a profound silence that swallowed the usual sounds of the woods. We entered cautiously, stepping onto a main street choked with weeds and fallen leaves. The buildings were mostly small houses, their windows dark and empty like vacant eyes. A general store stood at the corner, its sign barely legible. Further down we could make out a church, its steeple slightly askew. An unsettling feeling settled over me as we explored. There was no sign of recent habitation, yet the decay felt incomplete. It was as if the town had been left in a hurry, the remnants of daily life still visible in places. A child's wooden toy lay half buried in the dirt outside one house. Inside another, a table was set with dusty plates and cutlery. As the day wore on, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. A sense of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. Glancing into the dense woods that surrounded the town, I could sometimes catch a fleeting impression of something pale and still amongst the trees, a suggestion of a figure that vanished as soon as I focused. Night fell, bringing with it a deeper, more tangible sense of unease. We had decided to take shelter in the general store, its sturdy walls offering a semblance of security. As darkness enveloped the town, an unnatural quiet descended. The usual nocturnal sounds of the forest were absent, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure. Then the shifting began. It was subtle at first, a creaking sound from outside. Looking out of the boarded-up windows, I could discern the shapes of the buildings against the faint moonlight. Something felt different. The church steeple, which I remembered seeing to the east, now seemed to be positioned to the north. Panic began to stir within the group. We tried to rationalize it, attributing it to the disorienting effect of the darkness and our exhaustion, but as the hours passed, the changes became undeniable. Streets that had run north-south now seemed to curve in unexpected directions. Buildings we had passed earlier were no longer where we remembered them. The town was becoming a maze. We attempted to leave to retrace our steps back to the path, but the familiar landmarks were gone. The woods surrounding the town seemed to have shifted as well, the trees forming an impenetrable barrier. Every path we tried led us back to the town's centre, to the silent, empty buildings that now seemed to loom over us. One of our group, a young man named Ben, disappeared first. We had been huddled together in the general store, trying to make sense of the impossible geography of the town. He had stepped outside for a moment, and then nothing. We called his name, our voices echoing eerily in the stillness, but there was no response. The next to vanish was Sarah. We had been trying to navigate one of the winding streets, clinging to each other in the darkness. She had been walking beside me, and then I simply didn't feel her presence anymore. I turned around, but she was gone, swallowed by the night. Fear became our constant companion, a cold dread that settled deep in our bones. We stayed together, the remaining few of us terrified to be alone. But the town seemed determined to separate us. In the disorienting darkness, we would lose sight of each other for mere seconds, only to find one less among us when we regrouped. Mark, Emily, then David. Each disappearance was silent, swift, leaving no trace. Now, I was alone. The shifting buildings loomed around me, their dark windows like gaping maws. The silence of the town was no longer empty. It felt pregnant with something unseen, something malevolent. I wandered through the deserted streets, my heart pounding with a primal fear. The layout of the town was now completely unrecognizable, a chaotic jumble of buildings that seemed to rearrange themselves with every turn I made. There was no escape, no way out of this endless labyrinth. Then I began to hear them, faint whispers carried on the still night air. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, soft murmurs that brushed against my ears like the touch of something cold. I strained to understand the words, but they were just below the threshold of comprehension, a sibilant susurrus that sent chills down my spine. As I stumbled through the darkness, the whispers grew slightly clearer, coalescing into something resembling language. They spoke of belonging, of a place prepared, of an ancient claim. The words seemed to seep into my mind, bypassing my ears altogether. The whispers spoke of her, a presence I had only glimpsed in the periphery, a stillness amongst the trees, the spectral figure I had sensed watching us since our arrival. The whispers intensified, swirling around me, filling my head. They spoke of roots that ran deep, of ties that bound. They spoke of this town and of me. And then one phrase became chillingly clear, echoing in the silent darkness, a statement of a horrifying, inescapable truth. You have always been hers. The house stood silent, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, the garden overgrown and wild. We gathered, a collection of cousins, aunts and uncles drawn together by the news of grandmother's passing. None of us had visited her often in recent years. The house had always held a certain stillness, a quiet that bordered on unsettling. Inside, dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through grimy windows. The air carried a musty scent, a blend of old paper and something else, something vaguely metallic and earthy. We moved through the rooms, sifting through the remnants of her life. Stacks of yellowed books, porcelain dolls with vacant stares and forgotten trinkets tucked away in dusty drawers. It was my cousin Michael who found it. In the back garden, amidst the overgrown weeds and tangled vines, stood a tree unlike any I had ever seen. Its bark was blackened and gnarled, twisted into grotesque shapes. The branches, bare even in the late spring, reached towards the sky like skeletal fingers. There were no leaves, no buds, no sign of life, yet it didn't appear dead, possessing a strange, dormant energy. We approached it cautiously, a silent circle of family members drawn by its bizarre appearance. The ground around the tree was bare, as if nothing could grow in its immediate vicinity. The air near it felt cooler, almost unnaturally so. That night, as we slept in the old house, I experienced a strange dream. Images flickered through my mind, distorted and unsettling. Familiar faces contorted into grotesque masks, and whispers echoed in the darkness. Words I couldn't quite grasp, but that left me with a profound sense of unease. The following day, things began to feel different. My thoughts seemed to take on a peculiar edge, sharp and cynical. Small irritations that would normally pass unnoticed now festered, growing into disproportionate resentments. I found myself scrutinizing my family members, noticing flaws and imperfections I had never paid attention to before. My Aunt Sarah, usually so cheerful and optimistic, became withdrawn and suspicious. She would eye us with a newfound distrust, muttering under her breath about hidden motives and ulterior agendas. My Uncle David, normally placid and easygoing, erupted in fits of sudden anger, his face contorted with a rage that seemed to come from nowhere. We spoke little, the usual familial chatter replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The air in the house felt thick with unspoken tension, a simmering undercurrent of negativity that permeated every interaction. Our thoughts seemed to be turning inward, becoming twisted and distorted versions of themselves. I found myself drawn back to the tree in the garden. Its blackened branches seemed to writhe in the gentle breeze, and the air around it held that same unnatural coolness. I had the distinct impression that it was listening, absorbing the growing negativity that filled the house. One afternoon, while sorting through grandmother's belongings, I found a collection of old leather-bound books hidden away in a locked trunk. Their pages were filled with strange symbols and handwritten text in a language I didn't recognize. There were drawings of plants and herbs, diagrams of celestial bodies, and intricate sigils. A chilling realization began to dawn. Grandmother had been more than just an eccentric old woman. The stillness of the house, the strange energy of the garden, the unsettling nature of the tree, it all pointed to something else, something darker. As the days passed, the changes within us intensified. Our thoughts became increasingly irrational, our emotions volatile and unpredictable. We argued over trivial matters, our voices sharp and accusatory. The bonds of family, once strong, began to fray under the strain of this unseen influence. I looked at my reflection in the dusty mirror. My eyes seemed different, darker, with a flicker of something cold and unfamiliar within them. My thoughts were no longer my own, tinged with a cynicism and negativity that felt alien. The tree in the garden seemed to pulse with a subtle energy, its blackened bark appearing almost glossy in the dim light. I had the terrifying certainty that it was the source of what was happening to us, that it was somehow connected to grandmother's hidden life. We were trapped, not just in the decaying house, but in a web of twisted thoughts and emotions that were not our own. Whatever grandmother had been involved in, whatever dark practices she had pursued, she had left it unfinished, and we, her unsuspecting descendants, were now bearing the burden. The house remained silent, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken resentments, the irrational fears, the creeping paranoia that had taken root in our minds. We moved through the days like puppets controlled by an unseen force, our thoughts spiraling into darker and more unsettling territories. The blackened tree stood in the garden, its bare branches reaching towards the sky, a silent testament to the legacy we had inherited. Our inheritance was not of possessions, but of something far more sinister, something that continued to twist and fester within us with no sign of release.